Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the latest anguish over phase 2 of our long-delayed Brexit standards controls, as businesses are complaining that it's even more expensive than the government suggested. Nobody really knows how the process is supposed to work, least of all the people managing the process. So earlier this year, we finally began standards controls on imports with requirements for health certificates, but no actual checks. We're now beginning phase 2, which is checks. Only we're not expecting the government to authorise many actual checks to take place. Much as we've seen with customs controls, the authorities prioritise traffic flow over compliance. In other words, if checks would cause too many delays, the government would rather smugglers carried on making out like bandits than let voters deal with noticeable shortages on the supermarket shelves in the run-up to the election. So you may think that if the authorities aren't going to do much actual checking, what's really changed? Well, the charges for a check supply. It's very much like with customs controls. For the first year after leaving the single marketed customs union, we essentially had no import controls at all. The trade border was just wide open. Then at the end of 2021, we introduced customs controls. But because the government can't afford to actually have permanent gridlock around Kent, they told authorities to prioritise traffic flow, which essentially means very few checks are carried out. Smugglers' paradise. And it's actually quite funny because I said a while ago, when it came to turn these checks on, they're not actually going to happen. And sure enough, ITV are reporting that goods have just been waved through today. Quelle surprise. But don't bother calling me Nostradamus, wasn't hard to work out. I have no internal knowledge of the process. I don't work in logistics. I never have. But I do pay attention to those who have, and I also have a mathematical background. It's really obvious enough. We don't have the facilities to carry out checks, and we don't have the staff. I know this because we still don't carry out customs checks properly. So much is still waved through, over 2 years after they began. So if at the time we're still waving a lot of customs checks through, like we're not carrying them out, it's not rocket surgery to know that we weren't going to be able to do standards checks properly either, was it? But as to customs checks, because the customs controls were technically in place 2 years ago, businesses exporting to Britain still had to go to all the expense of preparing. They still needed to arrange the paperwork. They still had to pay the fees. So the costs were there, whether or not anything was checked. The same now applies to standards controls. Even though there's not any actual checking going on, the paperwork still needs arranging, the fees still need paying, as if there were. Now, this would be bad enough, another new Brexit cost to doing business, which will mean small businesses in Britain end up shutting down. But there's been a lot of confusion about the new regime. I mean, the government only provided the details about the charges a few weeks ago. Not like 2 years in advance for this massive change. No, a few weeks ago. Not really enough time for businesses to adapt. But even then it was confusing. There are charges for certain types of goods, and then a charge cap of £145 for mixed consignments. The idea being if you've got lots of different goods in your consignment, as is likely for, say, small businesses, there's an upper limit of £145 to pay for those checks. That would still be too much for, say, a small independent deli that is ordering really small quantities of several foods, but it at least limits the cost for others. Only it turns out that what the government thinks a consignment is isn't what importers thought it was. They thought, oh, that's a lorry then. So if I've got all these things on a lorry, it'll cost me a maximum of £145. No, apparently the government meant something else. So there are, maybe it's just a pallet, I don't know. But there are reports now of businesses saying it's now costing like £1,500 per lorry of mixed goods. And consider something else in terms of these costs. These are just the fees for the checks, which probably won't happen and certainly aren't happening right now. Actually, these businesses are being charged fees for checks that aren't taking place. But there may also have been a health certificate required for these goods, which would have cost the exporter, who will add it onto the bill for you. And if journeys take longer as a result of this new layer of Brexit red tape, because checks are going to happen at some point, then transport costs will go up as well. If it's a real nightmare, we may end up with more EU-based lorry drivers going, yeah, I'm not doing the Britain run anymore, find someone else. So lorry driver shortages feel tighter again. Needless to say, this will mean the cost of food increases for British consumers. The reason the government kept delaying these measures is, well, it's partly because they never had a plan for this, even as we left the EU, and partly because they feared the inflationary impact. Inflation was always the rage last year, so they weren't going to introduce it last year. But inflation's much lower now, so Sunak thinks he can take the hit. That remains to be seen. It's going to increase the risk of people being able to afford basics and turn into cheaper sources of food, which are increasingly illegally imported, unfit for consumption foods, which pass across our borders every day because the authorities are not carrying out checks. We know this because a couple of years ago, about a year and a half ago, they decided to carry out some checks over a 24-hour period and find, holy cow, there's a lot of stuff coming over the border unchecked. So the plan is to still not carry out many checks. So now this illegal and dangerous trade is not likely to slow down. The combination of not securing our trade borders and driving the cost of legitimate foods up, because what's happening here, imagine what's happening here. We've increased the cost for businesses. Why have we increased the cost for businesses? To cover the cost of carrying out these checks in order to maintain standards, in order to check that food coming across the border is of the right standard, right? So we're charging the businesses those fees, but we're not carrying out the checks. So we've just put up the price, but we've not made our food supply chain any safer. So we're putting people at risk because now people are going to struggle more to afford food, go for cheaper sources. What are the cheaper sources? The illegal food that will make you very ill. Now, at this point, I'm also going to add in my usual reminder for those who will ask, oh, if we didn't have these checks before Brexit, Phil, why do we need them now? We did have these checks before Brexit. It's just that as part of a large single market, they took place across the EU, not all loaded up at the southern border of Britain. But EU officials only check for EU standards. We don't follow EU standards. We chose to manage our own standards. So now we have to check all our own stuff. Only we don't have the capacity to do so. Hence why we are now at risk. And the government know this. At the end of a Guardian article on this, there was a quote from the government. And it highlights for me just how unfit for purpose our media is. The Guardian, they're not pro-Brexit and they're not pro-Tory. And yet they allow the government to have the last word without counter. I'm going to read the quote and then explain exactly how it should have been reported. Government quote. These border checks are fundamental to protecting the UK's food supply chain, farmers and natural environment against costly diseases reaching our shores. Their cost is negligible compared to the impact of a major disease outbreak, such as foot and mouth disease in 2001, which cost businesses and our wider economy more than £12.8 billion in 2022 prices. We will continue to work with and support businesses throughout this process to maintain the smooth flow of imported goods. So first, they recognise that the border checks are fundamental to protecting our food supply chain and farmers. This is 100% correct. As they note the case of the foot and mouth from 2001 when we were in the EU, you don't eliminate that risk altogether because you can't check physically everything. You would never have trade. But you need to have checks to massively reduce the risk. So they recognise that we're creating this risk by not having these checks. So why have the Tories left us without them for over 3 years? And why do they continue to leave us without them? Remember, hardly any of these border checks are going to take place. Right now, none are taking place. Even when the system is fully implemented, when it's ramped up, there's still not going to be very many. The plan is not to have a proper regime of checks. The government are basically admitting that they are failing to deliver essential checks, and so both they and their ratty Brexit are endangering our food supply chain and farming sector, because these checks did take place when we were in the EU. They just took place somewhere else mostly. Second, about the cost being negligible compared to the impact of a major disease outbreak. Yeah, okay. But again, this shows how badly their hard Brexit has put us at risk. Remember, the government are not responding to an unexpected external factor here. This isn't like COVID or Russia's war. This is risk as a result of a policy which the Tories not only voluntarily implemented, but promised would have no negative impacts. I'd say risk in our food supply chains was a negative impact, wouldn't you? In fact, they've helpfully admitted that the risk of an animal disease can be incredibly costly. In 2022 prices, they said £13 billion. Yes, that's very costly. Why are they opening us up to this risk? As for continuing to work with and support businesses, don't make me laugh. They didn't even tell businesses how the system was going to work until a few weeks before it was due to begin. And even then, it seems they didn't explain it well enough, because businesses are now facing higher fees than they thought they would be. How on earth is a business supposed to operate when the government is randomly applying spurious charges all the time? The Tories used to claim they were the party of business, and indeed the party of small business. In reality, Boris Johnson had it right, didn't he? They are the party of F business. Tories should not be allowed to get away with talking as if they're dealing with a difficult situation that was dumped on their desk. They did this. They chose to do this. They chose to do it without a plan and without an honest public debate. This should be pointed out every time they say anything on the matter. And the final thing I should just add is, even when this system is fully implemented, because it's not going to be reciprocal. So, for example, our exports to the EU face full customs controls, full standards controls. Even when ours are fully implemented, we are not doing the same in return. That means we are going to continue to have fewer trade restrictions on EU businesses exporting to Britain than British businesses exporting to the EU. The EU are always going to have the upper hand in any future trade talks as a result of that. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.